Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and the heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways you can support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member. We can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. I'm delighted today to welcome Richard and David Kemmis Betty, as well as special guest Kadrak Chetri. Today, Richard and David will recount their father's experiences as a British Indian Army officer fighting in Malaya and being imprisoned in Singapore during the Second World War. Also today, they will be signing copies of their book, Half a Banana. So after this, I will whisk them upstairs to the shop where they will be able to sign copies. So there will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both our online and in-person audience. For our online audience, you can post questions in the chat bar, and these will be put to our speakers at the end of the talk. In the room, if you raise your hands, I'll run around with this microphone. Moving on with some technical points. Should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser. That usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that being said, I will now pass over to our speakers, and we do hope you enjoy this talk.
Thank you very much for the National Army Museum for allowing us to put this on. Special thanks to Amy and Danny for all their hard work. And I'd like to introduce, I'm Richard Kemmis Betty. I'm the eldest son of Peter Kemmis Betty, who you will hear a hell of a lot of, because it's really his book. David Kemmis Betty is my youngest brother. David Kemmis, is that better? Yeah, but my voice is a bit deep. David Kemmis Betty is youngest brother, he's still serving, and Kadrak Chetri is still serving, he's a Gurkha officer. Now he's here because his grandfather was Kalu Chetri. You'll hear quite a lot about that later. So, D-Day last year, June, I was clearing out the study and I came across my father's old diary that he wrote while he was a prisoner of war in Changi. And it was at that moment I knew it had to be published. There were great stories about D-Day, but I knew this was a fantastic story. And one thing led to another. I then found archive material when I was digging a bit deeper that led me to understand there was a story within a story. There was a name mentioned often in the correspondence called Alec. And that resulted in meeting Adam Ogilvie, who is the son of Alec Ogilvie. Now, Alec Ogilvie and Peter Kemmis Betty were childhood friends. The situation was then Alec Ogilvie went off to be a businessman in Calcutta after school, and he started his career very successfully. But war broke out. Peter Kemmis Betty, on the other hand, was from a military background. His father was gassed in World War I, and his eldest brother, Mervyn, was already in the Indian Army, and he was in the Royal Artillery serving on the northwest frontier. His elder sister, Barbara, had married a Gurkha, and it was absolutely inevitable that Peter would go to Sandhurst and join the army, and he ended up in the Indian Army going out to India. World War II broke out, and Alec Ogilvie, who was in Calcutta, then decided to join the army. He went to officer training school in India, very quickly, one thing led to another, but he ended up joining the same regiment, the 2nd Gurkhas, in India as Peter Kemmis Betty. So the two of them were together again, having been childhood friends. The battalion were training at the time to go and wage war in the Western Desert. And the orders came that they actually had to go down to Bombay and get on a ship, still expecting to go to the Western Desert. One of the officers noticed that the camouflage scrim was in fact green. But very soon after setting sail, new orders came that they were not off to the Western Desert, they were off to Port Swettenham on the west coast of Malaya. The 2nd Gurkhas were part of the 28th Indian Brigade, and from Port Swettenham they moved to Calcutta by train up to Ipoh. Ipoh was a wonderful place at that time. It was a very wealthy town. It had lots of good bars, it had facilities like sports facilities, and it even had a race course. The reason it was so wealthy is there was both tin and rubber businesses going on at the time. 6th of December, having wrecked a defensive position at Jitra, the officers persuaded the commanding officer that they should go to the local race meeting, which they'd done it before, but they wanted to go one last time to the local race meeting. The commanding officer hesitantly said, well, okay, but phone in after every race. And after the 5th race, they were told to hurry back, and hurry back they did. One thing happened after another very, very quickly. As you all will know, 7th of December, Pearl Harbor. 8th of December was the reports that the Japanese had landed in Thailand. And they were moving very quickly down towards Malaya. Peter Kemmis Betty led the battalion into positions at Jitra on the 9th and 10th of December. And these are Peter's words. We were in a position for only 24 hours before the Japanese attacked our positions. They came down the road on bikes and with light tanks. They came in at night shrieking, shouting, and letting off firecrackers. It was not easy to know how to deal with them. We didn't want to expend all our ammunition firing aimlessly at noises in the dark, so we waited until the targets could be clearly identified. We held our position for 3 days, and then the order came to withdraw under darkness. The fighting was intense. There were many, many acts of incredible bravery. Karak Chetri, who I have introduced you to, had his grandfather serving also in the 2nd Gurkhas, and he was a very senior Gurkha soldier. Karak, could you just talk us through the two citations of the MCs that were awarded?
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. First of all, good morning and a very warm welcome, if it's not already warm, and then the Gurkha Namaste to you all, and all the, also the online audience. As Richard already mentioned, I'm a 3rd generation Gurkha, Kalu Singh Chetri, which you will may hear about him a lot today. My one father, Vishnu Bahadur Chetri, and me, we all served in the same regiment. Been in the army for just over 33 years, and I have traveled today to speak to you from Colchester Garrison. My grandfather died without knowing about his MB, which I'm going to talk about later. 70 years later, in 2016, I collected his MB. So when I collected the MB, at that time, I had not met anyone who knew my grandfather, because I was not fortunate enough to meet my grandfather. So that's when, through various connections, Gurkha connections, really strong connections, I was fortunate enough to meet their pa, Peter Kemmis Betty. That was a very moving moment for me, if you like that is. So today, I'm very fortunate and very lucky to read like some of the extract from the both cites, and both of them got obviously MC. The military cross was awarded to both Peter Kemmis Betty and Kalu Chetri. On 29th of December 1941, Peter was commanding the detachment holding the breeze over the river Sungai Dipang. The breezehead area was under heavy fire. When all troops had passed in accordance with orders, he skillfully extricated his force. 3 times, the demolition charge failed to destroy the bridge. 3 times, he led his detachment forward again to cover the Sapper demolition party, which was eventually successful. The battalion suffered heavy losses from bombing, artillery, mortar, and small arms fire. Detachments were cut off time and time again and perpetually worn out and exhausted, often without food. Subedar Kalu officiated as a battalion Subedar Major during the retreat from North Malaya to Singapore on 7th of January 1942 at Slim River. Subedar Kalu, with his tireless energy, was an inspiration to all. Japanese tanks broke through, capturing and holding the road bridge over the river, which was the only escape route for 2 brigades. Subedar Kalu, undaunted by general atmosphere of confusion, coolly organized details of battalion headquarters to form a bridgehead under enemy mortar and tank fire, allowing so many to be extricated. Throughout the campaign, he set a high standards of courage and devotion to duty.
Thank you. Alec.
Into one Chinese village one day during our withdrawal, and they managed to feed us tea and biscuits for the whole battalion, which was a wonderful effort, and of course a very great danger to them, because the reprisals that they were sending out, they were risking, were considerable if the Japanese discovered that they had been helping us and so on. So it was a wonderful effort on their part. We eventually, though, after a few days, made contact, and the rest of the withdrawal took part. But the whole of the withdrawal is really a story in itself. I haven't come. It all lasted. The whole thing only lasted 2.5 months.
GR, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, they were taken out of the front line for a short spell around the 20th of January. And that allowed a military term of rest and recuperation for a couple of days. But during that time, he managed to get a letter off to his older brother, which David will now tell you about.
To Mervyn, very many apologies for not having communicated before now, but it has been a fast-moving life with extremely little time for anything other than the Japs. Our brigade got a hell of a hammering right from the very start, and we were only taken out of the immediate front line about a week ago, though where we are now threatens to become the front line again any moment. It has been a rather tough business with no air or tanks. The Japs were in the air almost the entire day, dive bombing and machine gunning everything they saw. The men took a long time to get over an episode about a month ago when half a dozen bombs fell slap in the middle of battalion headquarters. Some words cut out by the censor, a very nasty mess. We lost literally all our possessions except what we stood up in on one occasion when the Jap tanks broke through and cut us off from the line of retreat. We were the wrong side of the river and had to abandon all our transport and get back across a single file over a blown-up railway bridge. Many of the men were drowned trying to cross over lower down. That was following an all-night march down a railway line, not knowing where the hell the Japs were. We had a couple of very warm parties forming bridgeheads with my company. And on the second occasion, we were attacked in the half-light. We had to blow the bridge in the middle of the battle and had difficulty getting the men back over the river, after which we were subjected to the most unpleasant dive bombing attack by about 4 planes lasting 40 minutes or so. We were in the village with practically no cover, and the Jap mortars coming over us at the same time. Anyway, we got out of it okay, with remarkably few casualties. I got hit by a bit of something in the back of the ear, bled profusely, but it turned out to be infinitesimally small. The narrowest shave I had was on the second or third day of the show, right up north, when I was fired upon by our own troops, an Indian battalion, when returning to my company position at night. Luckily, I knew the company commander well, and by shouting out bloody loud, he heard me and stopped their firing. I rather envy you in Razmuk, Waziristan. Did you get any skiing? ? Peter.
David, thank you. The second Gurkhas were then straight back into the front line. The withdrawal continued, and they soon found themselves in Singapore.
On the east coast of the island in Changi, and we had no contact with them at all. And this was at the time when various parties were being called upon to go. We did not know where, by the Japanese. They'd suddenly summoned, we want 1,000 British troops and we want half a dozen British officers in 3 days' time, ready to move, sort of business. And nobody knew anything more just than that, you know, and you didn't know where they were going, other than the fact that by the law, by common sense and law of averages, they must be going off the island somewhere. So that's when this chap, Alec Ogilvie, and myself decided, well, let's, for goodness sake, let us try and stay on the island, and we might be able to contact our Gurkha soldiers. And we managed to do so by joining an organisation which was then in its infancy of growing vegetables to augment the rations of particularly the hospital patients and so on. And so we got, without knowing actually anything about growing, we didn't know anything about growing anything at all, but we got ourselves onto the organisation side of these gardens, which eventually became a very big do indeed. We had about 50 acres, not all under cultivation, that was interspersed with rubber estates and so on, but we had, no, exaggeration, 30 acres of land, a lot of which was actual garden plot. And we had 10 different areas organised, 10 different actual garden plots, some of which were broken into a subsidiary plot. And we took charge of these and got going, growing various rather peculiar vegetables, some of them, and we realised that you could start eating anything, including young hibiscus leaves and all kinds of things. And that's by the way. So we got organised into that to avoid going off up country, wherever it was. And then these stories came back of these horror stories came back of sickness and so on, and and we had stories of a railway being built and the Japanese extracting work from everybody under terrible conditions, and this was proved by the arrival back in our camp of some of the sick people from the north, from the railway, who arrived back looking very skeletonic and so on. We fed them up on vegetable stew and so on and so forth. So anyway, we avoided going up there by dint of trying to get contact with our chaps, which we did achieve to a certain extent. We managed to get in towards Singapore city itself, where our Gurkha soldiers were in these camps, and you'd see them on the side of the road, and we managed to chuck them a note saying, "All well with us, how are things, please give us, if when we come again, try and get us a note back," and sort of thing. And we established a bit of to and fro in the way of communication. Not an awful lot, but sufficient to give us an idea eventually of the conditions under which they were living, which was far worse, I may say, than ours. Oh yes. They tried to extract, they treated them very, very badly, because they tried to get them to join the Indian National Army, which was composed of people who went over to the Japanese side to fight against us, and a few Indian, the element of it, they succeeded to a certain minor extent in doing so. And our Gurkhas, very fortunately, were not involved in that. They refused, and for putting up a fight to do so, they were treated extremely badly, and put on half rations and given solitary confinement and all this sort of thing. Anyway, that's I am digressing.
Just a little bit about Changi before we come back to the situation of what Father was talking about. Changi was on the northeast side of the island, and the Changi prisoner of war camp was about 22 square kilometers. Within the Changi prisoner of war camp was Changi jail itself, and Changi jail housed the Singapore ladies and Singapore children. 1930, the UK had decided that Changi was of strategic importance, and there was a naval base, there was an air base, there were the Royal Engineers, there was the Royal Artillery, and they had been there for some time, and therefore within the campsite there were substantial houses, substantial buildings, officers' messes, sports fields, etc. And that just does help paint a picture. So the diary itself, the first entry into the diary, although they were captured in the middle of February, the first entry was not until the end of July. The first 3 months, Father didn't talk about anything in those first 3 months. The Suk Ching was a cleansing that took place by the Japanese, and reportedly between 7,000 and 15,000 Chinese were massacred, and they were massacred on an island just on the north side of Changi jail itself. The period was a period of organization and instilling discipline. The Japanese respected order. The Gurkhas were the same. They understood firm but fair. one person who got a lot more than he deserved of the firm was Kalu Chetri. And Karak will now tell you about the situation as to how Kalu Chetri won an MBE.
Subedar Kalu was a prisoner of war in Japanese hands in Singapore for more than 3.5 years after its fall, during the whole of which time, except for the period spent in a concentration camp, he was with the men of his battalion, separated and entirely cut off from the King's Commission officers. All contact was strictly forbidden under pain and very severe punishment. When Subedar Major Hari Singh Bohra was removed to a concentration camp, Subedar Kalu became the senior officer with his battalion. Shortly afterwards, he, together with the remaining Gurkha officers, were given a last chance to join the Indian National Army. Subedar Kalu counseled restraint, explaining that he was their representative and would answer for them all, in spite of what it might entail to himself. His wise counsel eventually prevailed, and a tragedy was averted. He firmly declined to surrender his loyalty and was removed to a concentration camp. At the end of the 4th day, he collapsed. Exhausted by the heavy work, the heat, the hunger, the thirst, still he remained steadfast and eventually was returned to his men. In June 1944, when all attempts by propaganda, threat, ill treatment, and torture had failed to break or even shake his brave spirit, he was placed in a separate camp. Here, he was the senior prisoner of war and had under him men of other Indian units, in addition to his own, in sum 1,500 men. During this period too, he sent signed reports by secret means to his commanding officer in the British camp, well knowing the great risk he ran to himself by so doing. Subedar Kalu, throughout, in spite of all adversity and through the darkest and often most helpless days, never wavered or lost heart. He maintained the highest traditions of his regiment and of the Indian Army and showed moral and physical courage, resource, and devotion to the highest order.
Thank you, Kada. Kalu showed immense bravery and courage. Luckily, it wasn't like that for the majority of the prisoners who stayed in Changi. The diary, indeed, is full of detail about the amount of food, the amount of money they had, but that's not what really mattered. What really mattered was getting enough to eat. Prisoners were forever hungry. The other thing that came across was smokes. Smoking helped suppress the feeling of hunger. And when the supply of cigarettes ran low, Peter even considered smoking his diary. Food was very important. The next meal was always something to look forward to. In those early days and ongoing, there were always fatigue parties, working parties. They were kept extremely busy. Peter, Kemmis Betty, and Alec Ogilvie, as you heard, signed up to manage the gardens. They did this to stay on the island. The production of vegetables became their daily routine and gave them a tremendous sense of purpose. That production of vegetables helped prevent starvation and malnutrition. The gardens were producing tapioca. Tapioca was used to make cakes and biscuits and chapati. There was a type of spinach in the diary. Father talks about having just cut 1 ton of spinach out of a total of 10 tons cut from the whole of the gardens. One of the main products that they grew, because it was so high in vitamin C and B6, was sweet potatoes. And he talks in the diary of just finishing planting 45,000 sweet potato plants, not on his own. He had at times some 200 people working for him. To encourage his workforce on the gardens, Peter quickly realized there needed to be some form of incentive. So first thing he would do on the gardens was get a vegetable stew brewing. They'd have that for lunch. And that actually gave them all the nutrients they needed to work hard. Life would have been very dull if it wasn't for the efforts of all the other prisoners. They obviously worked hard during the day on the fatigues, but they had to have something to look forward to. Peter looked forward to a swim in the sea, and that went on for at least 18 months until some rather over-exuberant Australians decided to moon the Japanese fleet as they came by. The Japanese commander was not pleased, and he put a stop to swimming. There were the big band concerts, quite excellent Australian and Dutch musicians. Plays were performed to a very high standard. Alec Ogilvie himself had some key roles. Peter was a very good sportsman and tried his hand at cricket. He reported on after one cricket game, a piffling performance. He obviously set his standards high. He found football exhausting. He had one game, but he found there was not enough energy on the low rations. He also played, unbelievably, some tennis, and they found some golf clubs and some golf balls so they could hit some golf balls occasionally. One of the things he looked forward to most were the talks. Within Changi, 17,000 prisoners and 100,000 moved through Changi. There were some very, very specialist people, from doctors to solicitors to all sorts. But one of the talks that he loved most hearing about was mountaineering. And he was then persuaded to give a talk himself on skiing, his absolute love. He talked about skiing in Gulmarg in northwest India. He also learnt German and Spanish until such time as the German and Spanish teachers were sent up north. He was very fond of music, and he learnt or started learning the cello and joined a choir. So important for morale was contact with the outside world. Getting contact to his Gurkhas was a key priority. The letters that came from the UK were a tremendous morale booster. They didn't come to start with, but in the end, Father had received some 45 letters from his home and relations. They were allowed to send postcards out, and he was allowed to send 5 in total. Not many words on those postcards, just to say, I'm doing all right, I'm fine, I'm well.
I think.
No, not at all.
Anyway, that was eventually all came to an end 3.5 years later, and we were reunited with our chaps.
How did you, mentally, how did you get through it? Did you just hope for the war to end, or How did you get through each
Well,
day?
we were fortunate in having information coming in. People were very courageous in keeping homemade radio sets. And they'd go to incredible lengths to get a set, and they'd keep it, for instance, in the bottom, false bottom of a water bottle and all that sort of stuff. And we were given news. Our morale was always reasonably high, and we were always going to get out by Christmas. That's the great cry. You can't possibly do another Christmas, so you know. And we was, on the other hand, the news came in, and it was all pathetically slow going. And the Mountbatten's lot, and the Americans creeping up the Pacific Islands, and one by one, and it was all very, very, very slow. And anyway, we had basically news filtering in. Not initially, actually. It took a bit of time for that to get going. And the chaps who ran these, who organised these radio sets, took a lot of risk in doing so. In fact, they were risking their lives very definitely, because the Japanese knew we were getting information, and they said the risk would be death and all this sort of thing. So and they went on doing it. But getting the news in the evenings was quite a business. We used to assemble after dark, having posted sentry in one of the huts. We would vary, of course, the hut that we were going to go to hear the news, but we would creep in quite slowly, having posted our sentries to see there were no Japanese sentries walking around. And we'd go in, and the chap giving the news would start, without any ado, he would start giving the news in quite a, and you had to keep your ears pricked or get near him, but otherwise, you know, he didn't do it. He obviously wanted to keep his voice low, because the whole thing was a question of risk. And he gave out the news. Now, he was not the chap who owned the radio, and he was probably 2 stages away from the radio, but the chap I'm thinking of, an Australian who had a tremendous memory, and he spouted all this out just once. I'll say there's only one sort of thing. And then we all dispersed. And so we had a very good idea as to what was going on. No, morale, morale wasn't always high by any means. In fact, there were long spasms of it when we really did wonder how long we were going to be there. It went on and on and on. We just put our trust in God that the thing eventually would come out okay.
Were you allowed correspondence back home? Were you allowed to send letters to your family?
We were allowed to send cards, and there was quite a reasonable incoming of mail, actually, unlike the Red Cross parcels, which the Japanese themselves seized. We were allowed to, during that time, I think we sent about 5 or 6 little postcards, and all you were allowed to say, it all had to be printed out in capitals, saying that you were fit and well, and you were doing, you know, saying I'm busy growing vegetables, fit and well, don't worry, and you know, that sort of thing. That was all. And they did arrive home in periods. I've got the cards still, and noted by my parents with little notes saying when they were received, which was well over a year after they were written in 2 of the cases. And so, and incoming mail came in sort of intermittent wodges and so on, and it did come through. It did, letters.
Can you, were you...
There were other morale boosters, and that was really down to the fact that the prisoners themselves were extremely loyal to each other. very, very supportive of each other. Things like the importance of celebrating a birthday and holding back a tin of bully beef to share for a birthday celebration, making the most of Christmas. Christmas cards, Christmas menus were painted. They really, really put a lot of effort in, because that was something always to look forward to. I already mentioned that in Changi jail itself were the children. Prisoners would prepare and make toys for the children for months ahead, and then those toys would be a wonderful surprise for the children and presented to them on Christmas Day. They had farewell gatherings for those that were going up north. They took time to visit friends who were in hospital, and they would meet in Smoky Joe's. Smoky Joe's was a cafe set up by an enterprising Australian. There was no coffee. There was some other mixture that they used to drink. But there they would meet and they would talk and smoke. And finally, and most importantly, the church. There were 30 clergymen, and they supported every single denomination. So church services took place regularly on Sundays, obviously at Easter, Good Friday, Christmas, and any other day that they felt they could have a service with a proper choir, music, everything. Those church services were, in some words, a form of counseling. They were very important to many of the prisoners.
The end of the war approaches. Prisoners had an inkling that the war was coming to an end, and messages on the radio were more and more encouraging, and a number of Allied aircraft, mainly American, were seen overhead in increasing numbers. On the 15th of August 1945, the Japanese commandant called the prisoners together and simply announced, "The war is over." In London, later that same day, an 8-year-old boy was visiting Madame Tussauds with his grandmother. An official stood on a chair and announced, "Japan has surrendered and the war is over." That same grandmother was Peter's mother. She was overwhelmed by the thought that Peter would finally be coming home, and she needed a strong cup of tea to recover. The 8-year-old boy is in the audience here today, Sir Michael Burton, a cousin and diplomat. Peter Kemmis Betty was released from captivity a few weeks later on the 7th of September, and that same day he wrote to his parents, "My dearest Mum and Dad, I've been awaiting the opportunity for such a long time of being able to write you a proper letter, that now this occasion has come at last, I scarcely know how to begin. It's all so overwhelming. The first thing to report anyway is that I'm extremely fit, and I only hope to God that you are both likewise. Been putting on weight rapidly during the last fortnight since we started getting Red Cross food. A great change from the eternal rice. And now I clock over 10 stone. We wrote 5 postcards in all, so hope that you got them. Your continued efforts with letters and cards were magnificent, they honestly were. And I was always envied as being a receiver of more than my share. I've not seen Alec Ogilvie for the past 5 months, as I was moved to another smaller camp, but I know he's fit and okay. I fully realise that you both must have suffered a great anxiety on my behalf, but Mervyn used to tell me frequently in his cards how magnificently you bore it all. 1,000 congratulations and thanks. I've never had any real hardship over the whole 3.5 years, as I never once left Singapore Island, where you probably guessed that I was. The old job of gardening was a damn good choice, gave me a permanent and interesting daily occupation, and made the time pass doubly quickly. Also kept me fit with exercise and daily greens, etc. Garden stew. But now it's all over. Mighty hard to realise. Managed to get down yesterday to see our men in the other camp. All seemed to be in very good heart and overjoyed at seeing us again. No knowing yet as to whether we will sail back together with them or not. Anyhow, presume I will go to Dehradun at first and then home with not too much delay. But I must see Mervyn. Hope I'm able to contact him and that he's not in some unget-atable war zone. So much still that I want to say, and we still have restrictions, but burning to see you both and all of Barbara's large family. My profoundest love, Peter. Thank you all for being here and listening, and those online, and we're very happy to take some questions in the time remaining.